This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association for Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is a political scientist at Concordia University in Canada. He is the director of the Azrieli Institute for Israel Studies there. We are here to discuss his latest research topic, a phenomenon called in the Hebrew political lingo kalantarism. Politicians switching parties in return for benefits. Professor Csaba Nikolenyi, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi Gilad, it's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so this person, Rachamim Kalanta, was a small-time local politician, a member of the Jerusalem City Council in the 1950s, who's remembered chiefly, or should I say solely, for ditching his opposition party and allying with then-Mayor Gershon Agron and providing him, in the process, with a much-needed majority in the council in return for an appointment as deputy mayor. This earned him an ism, kalantarism. My question to you, as a political scientist, what is it about kalantarism, a rather inconsequential and forgotten political episode in Israel, that piqued your interest?
Okay, what piqued my interest is precisely the ism part of the term. It shouldn't be an ism. There was a one-time event by Rachamim Kalanta, which of course created a very important legacy. Had it not been for that particular move, for that particular vote, goodness knows when the major educational institution of Reform Judaism in Jerusalem on King David Street would have come about. But if you look at the actual history of party switching, if you actually look at the history of this behavior, of this phenomenon, you really don't see that all too often. And by the way, Kalanta himself wasn't the first to move. He certainly wasn't the only one. At the municipal level, at the national level, there haven't been that many instances. So that's one. So why an ism? Yeah. Right? Isms usually are associated with patterned outcomes, with patterned processes. B, in a political system characterized by institutions that Israel has, specifically here I'm referring to the nature of the electoral process. Israeli voters vote for a closed party list, what's called a closed party list, where there is no immediate competition amongst candidates for electoral support. We really shouldn't be seeing this type of very personalized behavior in the legislature. And yet clearly we do. And there have been over a dozen instances when politicians actually cross the floor in the Knesset. Now, speaking at the national level, receiving very explicit favors, benefits, either the promise of a realistic spot on the...
So what was it about Kalanta? Is the sheer cynicism of his move that propelled him to notoriety?
What puzzled me about it was the puzzle that interests me. Why did he do it? And why he became the standard reference point thereafter? Now, Kalantarism is something that very surprisingly actually finds itself into, you called it the Israeli political jargon, but it's also part of the Israeli official, if you will, political lexicon. If you go on the website of the Knesset, it is there.
Right.
And usually this type of behavior, this type of phenomena, legislative phenomena, usually you don't find discussed on the websites of national parliaments.
Because it's not very flattering?
Because it is not very flattering. There is, for example, a very comparable phenomenon in New Zealand. It's called waka jumping, referring to the jumping from one surfboard to another. But this is something that, this is certainly not something that you would find defined in such explicit, clear terms on the website.
Because crossing the floor is something that is really prevalent in parliamentary systems around the world, isn't it?
Depending on the nature of the institutions in place. In some countries, and Israel is one of them, there are very explicit penalties associated with such a move. And in fact, about 8 years ago, when I spent a sabbatical at the Hebrew University, we started a project with another professor there, looking at why India and Israel in particular adopted very similar laws, legislative restrictions restrictions penalizing such behavior. Now, when Kalanter crossed the floor, he was free to do that, and he received everything that he could bargain for.
It was before the restrictions were imposed.
That's right. The restrictions came in after the aftermath of the famous stinking trick, the Hatar Gil Hamasriach.
In the late 80s.
That's right, in the 12th Knesset, that's right.
Briefly tell our listeners what it is before we go back to
Well, it was it was a very important pivotal moment in the history of the Second National Unity Government, formed between Alignment, Labour and Likud, and of course a host of other smaller parties. Now, in contrast to the previous National Unity Government in office between 84 and 88, where there was rotation between the leadership of the two major parties.
It's Shamir and Shimon Peres.
That's right. There was no rotatia in the Second National Unity Government, and that clearly gave an incentive, according to some historical narratives, for Labour, the party that didn't give the Prime Minister, to be always on the look for an opportunity. And in fact, Shimon Peres found this opportunity, made an alliance with Shas to bring down and in fact bring about a very historical vote, to vote out Yitzhak Shamir out of office. He was the first Israeli Prime Minister to actually fall out of office on a vote of no confidence. And that really was the stinking trick. What made it particularly stinking is that Shimon Peres, while succeeded in building a negative coalition, wasn't able to bring a positive coalition forward. He wasn't actually keep a 60-plus majority together to come into government. And within a short period of about 3 months, there were a number of very high-profile defections going back and forth. And the going rate for some of these defectors, you could think back of Yitzhak Modai and his small faction of 5 former liberal members of Likud, actually demanding a very, very significant cash deposit in order to make sure that what they demanded would actually be honored, generated such public outcry that contributed largely to the demands for and the eventual implementation of political reforms that Israel received.
So what were the restrictions that were imposed in the wake of this trick?
Yeah, so as a result, the legislation that was voted in effect came in the form of the 12th Amendment to the Basic Law on the Knesset. And essentially it said that if you defect, if you leave the party that got you elected, you cannot join any other party during the same Knesset, you cannot become a cabinet minister, you cannot qualify for party funding, and this was a particularly powerful provision, you cannot join the party list of any Knesset faction in the next election that is currently represented. Now, the caveat was that if 1/3 of the faction joins with you in the act of defection, then you're off the hook, because that's considered legal split. And very interestingly, and this is what piqued our interest when we started this project, India adopted in many ways, but when it comes to the 1/3 provision, almost exactly the same.
Because they also had a history of stinky trick?
Yes and no. No Indian Prime Minister fell out of office on a stinking trick. But Indian governments and the Indian Parliament suffered from major waves of party switching, just legislators typically flocking to the ruling Congress party. It never actually resulted in the fall of any national government. At the local level, at the provincial level, however, it did. Many Indian state governments, especially in the 1960s, fell as a result of defections. But the legislation was associated with a very different moment in Indian political history. And that's actually a very interesting contrast that we teased out between India and Israel.
Clearly, the idea of all those restrictions was to increase stability, and yet it didn't quite work. Because, despite all these restrictions, defections still continue. Maybe it's slightly more complicated than it used to be, but essentially it's still there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And every time when I'm presenting the data, my colleagues and my peers are very surprised. So there are about, depending on how you count defections and exits, and there are some technical nuances here to keep in mind, but since the first Knesset, there have been just about 160 cases of individual members of Knesset who leave their party group. And since the adoption of the legislative restrictions that we just talked about, just about half of this 160 has happened since. So if you look at sheer numbers, nothing has changed. Moreover, and this is a very important unintended consequence of the law, because of the 1/3 rule, the law actually artificially inflates the number of defections. Like, look at, for example, Ehud Barak's Ha'atzmaut faction. In the absence of the 5 members of the Labour Party,
that was 2012.
2011. Yes, you're right. Had the law not been there, Barak would have been able to walk if he had wanted to, much easier. But the very difficult relations between sort of his evolving faction and the rest of the labor faction, actually that friction had to be prolonged because neither side actually commanded that 1/3 that would have allowed either this side or that to walk without the penalty.
Right.
And it took quite some time, even for Barak, even though he was party leader and defense minister at the time, to get the fifth person on board, and then they were able to walk. And
which makes it even more cynical. I think.
Even more cynical.
If one person decides on a whim to defect, it's somehow forgivable or understandable. When actually 5 people betray the will of the voters in such a way, it discredits the political system even further.
Yeah, absolutely. You can say that. But one should not always be very cynical about voluntarism. It's difficult not to be cynical about, because what's very obvious is that you actually give a very tangible, concrete reward for going against the voters' mandate. But a point that was made to me about 3 weeks ago when I gave my most recent presentation on this project in Sde by the now late Professor Fegi, Zichrono Livracha, he made the point, Csaba, don't be always so pessimistic and cynical about these people, because often they are the ones, and certainly they may think that they are the ones who keep the purity of the party's ideology alive. Sometimes the party's leadership gets hijacked and the party starts moving against what they promised the voters. And if you actually talk to some of these people, some of the sort of kalanters or party switchers, they would tell you that actually they are truer to the ideology and to the voters' mandate than the rest of the party.
On paper he may be right, but I think that's
an interesting hypothesis. It hasn't. In the conversations I've had with some of these politicians, it hasn't been borne out yet.
Yeah. Do you think that really it's a manifestation of the chronic instability of the political system in Israel, or is it something that is just necessary evil that we must live with?
Party switching happens more often than in more countries, in more democratic legislatures than most people would be prepared to believe or to expect. I spent about a month this year in Australia studying the same phenomenon, and I found just over 100 instances since the Australian Commonwealth was created. And my colleagues, they were very surprised because they typically don't think that Australia, which has very, very strong political parties, would have party switching, and yet it does happen. So to come back to Israel, I think that in general it's endemic. It's endemic to any political process, and endogenous to see this type of movement, and it's not necessarily wrong. If you look at some of the legal opinions that have come down from various sources, former Justice Aaron Barak himself went on record saying that it's a very important part of a democratic polity to guarantee the freedom of individual members of the Knesset to vote their conscience, to behave as they fit, and there's nothing necessarily wrong about it. What I do want to say in terms of institutions, because your question suggested that, Gilad, is that I think we would see, and certainly my research leads me to believing that if Israel had a more restrictive electoral system, if it were more difficult to form new political parties, if new political parties found it more challenging to muster the necessary number of minimum votes that would get them into the next Knesset, politicians would think twice before they split and form new parties in a defective, calendaristic or non-calendaristic.
Okay, maybe the next government reform will have your name on it, Professor Csaba Nikolenyi.
I don't know if I would be flattered by that or not.
Who knows? You're a political scientist at Concordia University in Canada and the director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies there. Thank you very much for coming in today and talking to us about calendarism and its aftermath.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our trusted sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
אלוהים נתן לך במתנה דבר גדול, דבר נפלא. אלוהים נתן לך במתנה את החיים על פני האדמה.